Somewhere in the dirt of Normandy, in the late summer of 1944, a young German corporal sat by a shattered wooden fence. His name was Helmut. He was 19 years old. His uniform was torn, caked in mud, and stained with the grease of a broken tank. For 2 weeks, his regiment had survived on wild berries, dry crackers, and the muddy water of Normandy's drainage ditches. His belly was a hollow, burning ache. He expected to die. For years, the radio broadcasts in Berlin had warned him. They had told him that the Americans were savage. They had told him that the Americans executed their captives, or turned them over to the Soviet coal mines. So when a tall American military policeman approached him, Helmut closed his eyes. He waited for the sound of a pistol cocking, but the American did not draw his weapon. Instead, he reached into a green canvas pack and pulled out a small wrapped object. It was wrapped in clean paper. It was soft. It smelled sweet. Helmut slowly tore the paper open. Inside was a thick, square slice of white bread. It was snow white. It felt like a soft sponge in his dirt-stained, calloused hands. He took a bite. It tasted of milk. It tasted of sugar. It tasted of things he had not seen since his childhood. And then, Helmut did something that caught the American guards off guard. He did not smile. He did not say thank you. He looked at the slice of white bread, leaned his back against a post, and began to weep. He cried so hard his chest shook. The American soldiers stood in a circle, watching him sob over a piece of bread. They thought he was crying from relief. They thought he was crying because his war was over. But they were wrong. Helmut was weeping because, in that single bite of white bread, he realized a terrifying truth. He realized that the German army had lost the war, and that the German Empire was fighting an enemy with resources so vast, it was almost mechanical. How could a simple slice of white bread destroy a soldier's will to fight? To understand this, we must look beyond the battlefields. We must look at the secret weapon that did not fire bullets, a weapon of pure abundance. This is the story of how the United States used food to fight an ideological war, and how a simple loaf of bread became the ultimate psychological defeat for Hitler's army. For years, the German people had been fed a steady diet of illusions. The Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, had painted a specific picture of the United States. To the German public, America was a nation on the brink of collapse. They were told that the American economy was ruined by the Great Depression, that the cities were dark, dirty, and filled with starving, desperate people. Nazi propaganda claimed that the United States was a weak, soft nation, that they lacked the discipline to fight a real war. German soldiers were told that U.S. forces were poorly trained, cowardly, and easily defeated. And most importantly, they were warned about what would happen if they surrendered. Goebbels warned that the Americans had no food, that they would starve their prisoners, or turn them over to the Soviets to work in the frozen wastes of Siberia. This propaganda was highly effective. German soldiers fought with desperate fury, believing that surrender meant death. But by 1944, the reality on the ground was starting to crack the propaganda wall. In Germany, food was disappearing. The home front was starving. Civilians were living on strict rations. Meat was a luxury. Butter was gone. And the bread, the staple of the German diet, was changing. The German army had always relied on Kommissbrot. It was a traditional, dark, dense rye sourdough. It was heavy, sour, and built to last. In the early days of the war, it was high in quality. It kept the Wehrmacht marching across Europe. But as the Allied blockade tightened, grain supplies in Germany collapsed. The bakeries could no longer make pure rye bread. They began to use fillers. First they added potato flour, then barley and rye husks. By the winter of 1944, the situation was desperate. Bakers were ordered to use Holzmehl, literally wood flour. Sawdust. The bread became dry, gritty, and dark gray. It tasted of pine and earth. It crumbled into dust. German soldiers on the front lines were eating bread that was part wood, surviving on watery cabbage soup, and marching on empty stomachs. They were told that this sacrifice was necessary because the rest of the world was starving too. They believed that the Allied soldiers were just as hungry as they were. They believed that the American empire was hollow. Until they were captured, the battle for Saint-Lô had been a meat grinder. For weeks the Wehrmacht had fought for every hedge, every stone barn, every narrow lane. They had been told that if they held the line, the Allied invasion would collapse. They had been told that the Americans were running out of ammunition and men. But when the lines finally broke and the shells stopped falling, the German survivors walked out of their bunkers with their hands up. Among them was a veteran sergeant named Karl. Karl had fought in Poland, in France, and on the frozen plains of Russia. He was a hard man, not easily shaken. He had seen his friends die, his homeland bombed, and his army retreat. But nothing had prepared him for the moment of capture. As he and his men were led to the rear, they passed the American supply depots. Karl stopped and stared. He did not see columns of tired, hungry men. He saw miles of trucks. He saw mountains of crates, stacked 20 feet high. He saw giant fuel bladders, filled to the brim with gasoline. And he saw the American soldiers. They did not look like men who had been fighting a war. Their uniforms were clean. Their faces were shaved. They were laughing, and they were eating, not the dry, gray crackers of the Wehrmacht, but fresh, hot meat and white bread. Karl looked down at his own hands, holding a piece of moldy, hard Kommissbrot he had saved in his pocket. The contrast was brutal. It was the first time Karl realized that the maps he had been shown in Berlin were useless. The maps showed lines and arrows, but they did not show the trucks. They did not show the supply depots, and they did not show the bread. The journey of a German prisoner of war began with a shock. After capture in North Africa or France, they were marched to the ports. They were loaded onto massive American Liberty ships. These ships were returning to the United States after delivering troops and weapons to Europe. The prisoners expected the worst. They expected dirty, cramped holds, minimal water, and beatings. Instead, they found clean hammocks. They found running water. And they were served meals that made them rub their eyes in disbelief. They were given meat 3 times a day. They were given fresh fruit. And they were given white bread. Many prisoners initially refused to eat it. They were suspicious. They believed the food was poisoned, or that the Americans were fattening them up before executing them. But as the days passed and the meals kept coming, their suspicion turned to confusion. And then the ships reached the east coast of the United States. As the transports sailed into New York Harbor or Boston Harbor at night, the prisoners crowded the decks. They looked out at the shoreline, and they froze. For years, Europe had been cast in total darkness. The blackout laws were absolute. Berlin, Paris, London, all were pitch black to hide from the bombers. But here, across the ocean, the American cities were glowing. The skyscrapers of New York were ablaze with millions of electric lights. The neon signs of Times Square flashed in red, yellow, and blue. Streetlights lined the avenues. Cars moved in endless glowing streams. There were no bomb craters, no ruined buildings, no smell of burning brick and cordite. The prisoners stood on the decks in absolute silence. The propaganda had told them that America was ruined. But before them lay a civilization that looked untouched by the global war. It was a city of light. At that moment, the first cracks in their loyalty began to form. But the true test of their worldview was still to come. A test that would take place in the quiet countryside of the American heartland. To the German prisoners, the sight of a fully lit city was more than just a visual shock. It was a political statement. In Germany, a single light bulb showing through a window could bring a visit from the Gestapo. The darkness was a symbol of their sacrifice, of their struggle, of their control. But here the lights were on. All of them. It meant that the Americans did not fear the German bombers. It meant that the ocean was a barrier that the Luftwaffe could not cross. It meant that the war, which had consumed every aspect of life in Europe, was a distant project for the United States. The prisoners realized that while Germany was straining every muscle, spending every mark and burning every drop of oil just to survive, the Americans were living in comfort. They were transported from the ports to the trains, and the trains were just as shocking. They were clean, they were warm, and they were filled with civilians who did not look hungry. As the trains rolled through the night, past farms, past towns, past factories, the prisoners saw the lights in the windows of ordinary homes. They saw families sitting around tables. They saw children playing. They saw a world that had not been broken by the war. And they began to ask themselves a question that Goebbels had never answered. If America was on the brink of collapse, how could they afford to leave the lights on? By the end of the war, the United States was housing over 425,000 German prisoners. They were spread across more than 500 camps, from the hot fields of Texas to the forests of Michigan. The U.S. government faced a massive logistical challenge. How do you house, guard, and feed an army of enemies on your own soil? The answer lay in a document signed in 1929, the Geneva Convention, specifically Article 11. The United States was a signatory to this treaty, and the U.S. military command decided that they would follow it to the letter. Article 11 was simple. It stated that the food rations of prisoners of war must be equal in quality and quantity to the rations of the detaining powers' depot troops. In plain terms, this meant that German prisoners had to eat the same food as American soldiers stationed in training camps. This was not done out of simple kindness. It was a calculated strategy. First, the U.S. wanted to ensure that Germany would treat captured American soldiers well in return. Second, well-fed prisoners were easier to manage. They did not riot. They did not try to escape. And third, the U.S. had a massive labor shortage. With millions of American men fighting overseas, the farms, forests, and factories were empty. The German prisoners could work, but to work they had to be fed. Under the rules of the treaty, prisoners who worked were paid. They earned 80 cents a day. They were not paid in real dollars, but in camp coupons. Canteen scrip. With these coupons, they could visit the camp store, the post exchange. And it was here that the German soldiers experienced a level of comfort that was long gone in Europe. They could buy Coca-Cola for 5 cents a bottle. They could buy Hershey's chocolate bars. They could buy fresh peaches, toothpaste, soap, and tobacco. They had access to hot showers every day, clean sheets, and heated barracks. For many soldiers who had spent years freezing in Russia, this was not a prison. It was a resort. They began to write letters home to Germany. Letters that described the abundance of America. Letters that the German censors tried to destroy because they knew the truth would crush the morale of the civilians back home. But the most powerful symbol of this abundance remained the food in the mess halls, specifically the bread. To the German soldier, the camp canteen was a place of magic. In Germany, sugar had been rationed since 1939. Chocolate was a memory. Tobacco was dry, harsh, and made of cabbage leaves. But in the American canteens, the shelves were packed. A German prisoner named Hans wrote in his diary about his first visit to the camp store. He wrote that he stood in front of the counter for 10 minutes, unable to speak. He saw rows of brown bottles of Coca-Cola. He saw piles of candy bars. He saw real American cigarettes. He bought a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents. He took a drink. The sweet, bubbly liquid was like nothing he had ever tasted. It was the taste of sugar, the taste of wealth, and he bought a chocolate bar. He ate it slowly, slice by slice, savoring the rich, creamy taste. To Hans, this was not the behavior of a nation that was losing a war. It was the behavior of a nation that had so much wealth, it could afford to sell its luxuries to the men who had sworn to destroy it. The canteen was a daily reminder of the economic gap between Germany and America. Every bottle of Coca-Cola was a lesson in logistics. Every chocolate bar was a challenge to Nazi ideology. But the greatest challenge of all was served not in a bottle, but on a tray. Every morning, the camp bakeries turned out thousands of fresh loaves of white bread. It was standard American military bread, made from refined white flour, enriched with vitamins, sweetened with sugar, and baked to a soft, fluffy texture. To the American soldiers, it was just bread. Generic, ordinary. But to the German prisoners, it was a revelation. When they first saw it on their trays, they did not believe it was bread. They called it Kuchen, cake. They thought the cooks had made a mistake, or that they were being served dessert before the meal. Some prisoners refused to eat it with their meat. saving it for the end of the meal to eat with jam or sugar. But the real psychological impact was not the taste. It was the consistency. In the German army, bread was rationed down to the gram. If a soldier lost his bread ration, he went hungry. So when the German prisoners were given 2 thick slices of white bread and saw piles of extra bread sitting on the serving tables, they panicked. They believed this was a trick, a one-time display of wealth to make them cooperative. So they did what any starving soldier would do. They hoarded it. They stuffed the slices into their pockets. They carried them back to their barracks, and they hid them under their mattresses. They wanted to have a reserve for when the food stopped. But the next day they went to the mess hall, and there was more white bread. And the next day, and the next. Within a week, the barracks began to smell. The hidden bread under the mattresses was growing moldy. The camp commanders noticed the smell and ordered a search of the barracks. When they lifted the mattresses, they found dozens of green, moldy loaves of white bread. The American guards were confused. They asked the prisoners why they were hiding bread when they were fed 3 meals a day. The prisoners did not answer. They could not explain the deep, instinctual fear of starvation that had chased them across Europe. But as the guards threw the moldy bread into the trash, the reality finally set in. The Americans were not running out of food. They had so much white bread that they could afford to throw it away. This was the moment the young corporal had experienced in Normandy. The moment of weeping. It was the realization of the absolute asymmetry of the war. Germany was fighting with wooden bread, starving civilians and dying horses. America was fighting with white bread, floating ice cream factories and endless supply lines. The war was not just lost on the battlefield. It was lost in the grain elevators of the Midwest. The German soldiers realized that their leaders had lied to them. Not just about American brutality, but about American capability. The white bread was the ultimate deradicalization weapon. It did not argue. It did not lecture. It simply sat on the tray, soft and white, proving every day that the Third Reich was doomed. Camp Hearne, Texas, was one of the largest POW camps in the country. It housed thousands of German soldiers, many of them captured in North Africa. These men had been under the command of General Erwin Rommel. They were tough, disciplined, and proud, but Camp Hearne would be the site of a strange, silent confrontation. An inspection of the barracks in 1944 revealed a bizarre pattern. Almost every mattress in the camp was stuffed not just with hay, but with bread. The American officers were baffled. They thought the prisoners were planning an escape. They thought they were building a secret food store for a breakout. But when they questioned the camp spokesman, a German sergeant, the explanation was simpler and sadder. The sergeant explained that the men could not sleep knowing there was food they had not eaten. In Europe, bread was life. To leave a piece of bread uneaten was a crime. To throw bread away was a sin. The prisoners could not accept that the white bread was free. They could not accept that it was endless. So they hid it, even when it grew green, even when it rotted. They kept it close like gold. The American camp commander did not punish them. Instead, he ordered that the bread baskets in the mess hall be left open 24 hours a day. He wanted the prisoners to see that the bread would never run out. It was a psychological victory. Within a few weeks, the mattress hoarding stopped. The prisoners realized that they were safe. And they realized that the economy that had built their tanks was nothing compared to the economy that baked their bread. For many German prisoners, the breaking point did not come from a lecture. It did not come from a movie about the concentration camps. It came from the food. A German prisoner named Wilhelm recalled his own moment of breakdown. He had been captured in Normandy. He had been a member of the Hitler Youth. He was filled with national pride. But on his 3rd day in the camp, he was served a dinner of roast pork, gravy, green beans, and white bread. He looked at the white bread. He thought of his mother in Berlin. He remembered her last letter. She had written that she was surviving on 2 slices of dark, gritty bread a day. That she was cold. That she was hungry. And here he was, an enemy soldier who had tried to kill Americans, being fed meat and white bread in a warm hall. Wilhelm began to cry. He could not eat. He sat at the table, his tears falling onto the white bread. He realized that the war was a madness. He realized that the leaders who had sent him to fight had lied to him. They had told him that Germany was the center of the world. But the center of the world was here. In a country that had so much food, it could afford to treat its enemies like guests. Wilhelm's tears were the tears of a shattered worldview. The white bread had done what the artillery could not. It had bypassed his defense mechanisms. It had touched his hunger, and it had won his heart. But while the white bread was winning the minds of the prisoners, it was creating a storm of anger outside the camp gates. The U.S. government's adherence to the Geneva Convention was not popular with the American public. By 1944, the American home front was feeling the weight of the war. Civilians were living under strict rationing. Meat was scarce. Butter, sugar, coffee, and gasoline were limited. American mothers were struggling to find shoes for their children. And yet, just down the road, behind the barbed wire of the POW camps, German soldiers were eating fresh beef, drinking hot coffee, and consuming white bread without limit. The contrast was sharp, and it grew sharper when stories began to leak to the press. In April of 1945, newspapers ran headlines that shocked the nation. One paper in Texas ran a story titled, "Pampered Nazi Prisoners in Texas Camp Fat as Hogs." The public was outraged. How could the government feed the men who had killed American boys better than the citizens who were funding the war? Letters flooded Congress. Mothers of fallen soldiers demanded to know why their sons had died, while the killers were gaining weight in America. Reports showed that some German prisoners had gained 30, 40, or even 50 pounds during their captivity. The government defended the program. They pointed out that the treaty required it, and they warned that if the U.S. cut rations for German prisoners, the German government would retaliate by starving the American soldiers held in Europe. But there was another, darker controversy brewing in the American South, a controversy of race. Many of the POW camps were located in the southern states: Texas, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi. These states were governed by Jim Crow laws, absolute segregation of white and black people. This created an ironic and painful paradox. German prisoners of war were white. The soldiers guarding them and the civilian workers on the railroads were often black Americans. Under the local laws, German prisoners, sworn enemies of the United States, were allowed to sit in the white-only sections of passenger trains. They were allowed to eat in white-only restaurants along the transport routes. Meanwhile, the black American soldiers who were wearing the U.S. uniform and guarding them were forced to sit in the segregated cars. They were denied service at the same restaurants. Black newspapers during the war wrote bitter editorials about this reality. They pointed out that a German soldier who had worn the swastika was treated with more dignity in the American South than a black American citizen who was fighting for his country. This tension would linger long after the war. It was a reminder that while America was a land of abundance, it was also a land of deep, unresolved divisions. An abundance that could feed its enemies, but could not yet guarantee equality for its own citizens. The double standard was visible every day. In the fields of Mississippi, black sharecroppers worked under the hot sun, earning pennies a day. Just across the road, German prisoners worked on the same crops, paid 80 cents a day in camp coupons, and fed 3 meals of meat and white bread. A young black U.S. Army corporal named George wrote a letter to a newspaper in Chicago. He wrote that he had spent 2 years fighting in North Africa, only to return home and find that a captured German pilot was sitting in the front of the bus, while he, a decorated veteran, was ordered to the back. He wrote that the German prisoner looked at him and smiled, a smile of victory, not a military victory, but a social one. The German soldier realized that in America, his white skin was a passport that was more valuable than the uniform of the country that had captured him. This irony was not lost on the civil rights leaders of the era. They used the treatment of German POWs as a powerful argument against segregation. They asked, If the United States can afford to follow the rules of humanity for its enemies, why can it not follow the rules of equality for its own people? The white bread of America was sweet, but for the black soldiers who guarded the camps, it had a bitter taste. When the war ended in May of 1945, the U.S. camps began to empty. The prisoners were sent back to Europe, but they did not return to the Germany they had left. They returned to a nation in ruins, a nation of ash, hunger, and division. As they stepped off the transport ships into the destroyed cities of Hamburg or Munich, they were greeted by their starving families. The diet in Germany after the war was worse than during the conflict. For many years, the only food available was the black market rations and the meager aid provided by the Allies. And once again, the German soldiers found themselves thinking of the white bread of America. The experience of captivity had changed them. They had spent 2 or 3 years in a land of light, warmth, and abundance. They had seen that democracy worked, not because of the speeches of politicians, but because of the physical reality of its economy. Many of the former prisoners never forgot their time in the United States. In the decades after the war, thousands of them returned. They emigrated to the U.S. They married American women. They bought farms in the Midwest, and they became American citizens. The simple loaf of white bread had done something that bombs could not. It had dismantled their loyalty to a dictatorship. It had shown them that a society built on freedom and production was stronger than one built on conquest and control. Helmut, the young corporal who had wept in the dirt of Normandy, survived the war. He returned to Germany, rebuilt his life in the ruins of Frankfurt, and eventually came back to visit the land of his captivity. In 1975, he traveled back to America. He went to the site of the old camp in Texas. Nothing remained but concrete foundations and rusty fence posts, swallowed by the weeds. But Helmut did not look at the ruins. He walked to a local grocery store. He bought a loaf of white bread. He did not hide it. He sat on a bench in the park under the warm Texas sun and ate it slice by slice. And this time he did not cry. He smiled, because he knew that the bread had not just fed him. It had set him free. What would you do if you were in the corporal's shoes? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more untold stories of World War II. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next episode.